So what I'd like to talk about today is how you do linguistics. And so my focus in this talk is what kind of data do we need? How do we go about doing linguistics? And I'm going to argue very strongly for a corpus-based approach and really for the approach that John Sinclair pioneered. I think I want to start by saying that the observation of natural language, like the corpus-based approach, is a really long-standing approach, but it's one that's often been questioned in linguistics, right? And so there's a long history of people questioning whether a corpus-based approach is sufficient to do linguistics. And I like to argue today that it's not only sufficient, but that it's all you need, and that it's really necessary to do corpus linguistics to understand language in general. The reason why corpus linguistics has been questioned, there's usually kind of two main or three main kind of attacks on it. The one is that it doesn't give you enough positive evidence, right? So the idea is that you can't see everything that's possible in language in a corpus. No matter how big it is, there'll be things missing from it that exist in language. The other side of this is that you don't get negative evidence, and that is that you can't see, all you can see is what does happen, and you can't see what doesn't happen. And so for this reason, the argument is normally that you need to also have intuition data. So you need to be able to get data about what doesn't happen, and you do this by asking informants or speakers of a language if something's possible or not. And so today I'd like to kind of argue against that point. Here's a quote from Chomsky. So he's the one that's probably most notable for arguing against this idea. And this is a famous quote that often gets quoted. I'll read it out here, though. Corpus linguistics doesn't mean anything. It's like saying, suppose physics and chemistry decide that instead of relying on experiments, what they're going to do is take videotapes of things happening in the world, and they'll collect huge videotapes of everything that's happening, and from that, maybe they'll come up with some generalizations or insights. Well, you know, sciences don't do this. And so this is the argument. I'd like to argue against this today, and I'd like to show this in two different ways. First, what I want to show is, and I want to argue, is that the success of large language models, the fluency of large language models, which are trained entirely, or at least at the base level, trained entirely on just observing data, is evidence against this claim, that the success of large language models shows that you can infer the structure of language entirely from observation. But I want to push it a little bit farther and say that it's not any type of corpus linguistics that claims this. It's specifically the type of corpus linguistics that comes from John Sinclair, that was developed at this university by Sinclair and his colleagues. I think that the success of large language models is really validation of Sinclair's approach, and it's an approach that's been maligned a lot in corpus linguistics. And then what I want to then do, and this isn't on your, isn't in the abstract, is I want to show you an example of working with what I think is effectively a Sinclairian analysis. This is a really large corpus of social media data, and I'm going to show you, this is a study of double modals. The idea here is that you're going to see that intuitions have led people astray on this, on this construction. That our understanding of double modals has been not only impoverished, but generally wrong because we've relied on intuitions. And then as soon as we start looking at lots of data, we see a very different pattern. So these are the two parts of this talk. I'll do it in two stages. I do want to make a quick note about what I'm not talking about. So we just got back, the Corpus Linguistics Conference was at Aston here in the city last week. And there was a lot of debate there about whether or not large language models are useful for doing linguistic analysis. So, like not as model, like not the idea of a large language model, but like using them to, say, annotate texts or to get examples and other things like that. And I don't want to really get into that. I'm not going to argue that they're good or bad. It seems to me they can be good and they can be badly used. But I want to make a more general claim here about methods. I think maybe more interestingly or importantly, I'm not arguing here that LLMs, the success of LLMs, provide any kind of evidence of how people learn language. It's not my expertise. I think like lots of people here, like Susan or Wolfgang or others, I don't really care that much about how people learn language. But I think that it seems that human language acquisition is different than how LLMs are trained. Obviously these LLMs get way more data than a human does, and uses way more energy to learn language than like a baby would. So that's not what I want to talk about, and I think it's important because that's the debate that's really dominated linguistic discourse over the last few years, right? There's been a ton of arguments about whether or not large language models are good models of language acquisition or good models of language knowledge, and I think it's kind of not a very interesting debate, really, and I think it distracts, maybe purposely, from a much more important debate, which is about how we go about studying language, and I think the success of LLMs tell us something really clear about that. And in particular, what I want to argue is that this shows how we as linguists, not as language learners, but as people who study language, can go about studying the grammatical structure of language. Okay, so I'm going to do this in two parts. First, I'd like to talk about, show that we don't really need negative evidence. And this is, I think, maybe the main thing we can take away from large language model success. That is, they're not told what isn't in a language. They're only given examples of what is in a language, and yet they seem to be able to infer linguistic structure in great detail. Okay, the point I want to start with here is that often in these discussions we hear about when we're talking about kind of Chomsky and formal linguists against applied linguists and corpus linguists, we often hear that this is sort of like a new debate, right? That corpus linguistics is the innovation. But in some ways that's not really true. The basic methodological innovation of Chomskyan linguistics was to move away from natural language into intuitions. And so in many ways the tradition that we're all a part of here in corpus linguistics is a very old one that stretches back from before Chomsky, and in large part that's what he was reacting to. That is to say, they rejected, Chomsky and other formal linguists rejected the observation of language use, which was the standard before them. And that was replaced with looking at intuitions, looking at introspection, looking at judgment. Here's a quote from Frederick Neumayer, who's sort of the foremost sort of historian of linguistics in the US, a generative grammarian himself. And he writes this, talking of Leonard Bloomfield and others of that time. So these are American structuralists from the first half of the 20th century. He says, Bloomfield's view of science, which members of his group adopted enthusiastically, pointed to linguistic descriptions that were essentially catalogues of observables and generalizations extracted from observables by a set of mechanical procedures. These are often called discovery procedures. And then he quotes, this is Neumayer here, quoting Zelig Harris, who was Chomsky's own supervisor, and this is what Harris said: the overall purpose of work in descriptive linguistics is to obtain a compact one-one representation of the stock of utterances in the corpus. There's that word there, corpus, already, right, back in 1951. And even if you look at syntactic structures, you'll see that terminology throughout. And then Neumayer goes on to say, given their subjective nature, informant's judgments were looked upon with suspicion. And so that's, pretty consistent with like a modern corpus linguistics view, at least, a fairly extreme one that I endorse myself. Okay, so why was that shift done? Well, part of it was because of this focus on language competence over language performance, right? So how do children learn language? How do we represent language in the mind? And so this was seen as being more basic and fundamental than the analysis of performance, which was seen as not giving you a good basis for understanding how competence works. And this is very closely linked to the poverty of the stimulus argument, right? Which is that children don't get enough input to infer the structure of language, that they must have a lot of inbuilt knowledge. I think it's important to say then that, these two goals of linguistic inquiry, so to explain the structure of language and to explain its acquisition, are fundamentally can be distinguished, right? These are two separate things. They might well be linked, but we can distinguish them. These are two different things that linguists can do, right? Study how language works in the real world and study how it's acquired. They are often conflated. So here's a Chomsky quote from Aspects, and he makes this point directly here. This is right from the start of probably his most famous book. The problem for the linguist, as well as for the child learning language, right? So they've been conflated here effectively, but he still distinguishes them, is to determine from the data of performance the underlying system of rules that has been mastered by the speaker-hearer that he puts to use in actual performance, right? So there's knowledge of grammar. Observed use of language, like that a corpus would provide, may provide evidence as to the nature of this mental reality, but surely cannot constitute the actual subject matter of linguistics if this is to be a serious discipline. So he draws the distinction, and he tells us that this isn't itself a valid object of study. And then he goes on later on, a few pages later, to say, there seems to be little reason to question the traditional view, and I'm not sure it is the traditional view, right? We just heard that it wasn't, that investigation of performance will proceed only so far as understanding of underlying competence will permit. And I think that's a pretty common view now in generative linguistics, where performance isn't necessarily ruled out as being interesting, and the study of corpora isn't excluded, but it's seen as needing to be based upon competence. And so, I mean, the basic point I believe is that there's no reason why the child and the linguist must adopt the same approach to inferring the grammar of language. Okay, we can think of lots of other examples where we study other things that we don't assume that the person who's doing the research does it like the human. I don't know, like voting patterns, right? Political scientists don't need to study who you vote for based on how people vote, individuals. And then also, there is no reason to insist that the goal of linguistic research must be to understand language acquisition or competence. There's other things we can do, which is to study language use. Here's a Wolfgang quote, which I agree with wholeheartedly. The focus of corpus linguistics is on meaning. Meaning is what is being verbally communicated between members of a discourse community. Corpus linguistics looks at language from a social perspective. It is not concerned with the psychological aspects of language. It claims no privileged knowledge of the workings of the mind or of an innate language faculty. I don't think, Wolfgang could tell us, but I don't think the point here is that you can't study the acquisition or the knowledge of language, but just that there's another thing that we can do, which is study language itself as used in the real world. And this is a view you'll see expressed by others as well. I think this is Adam's favorite quote. I have resisted, from Bill above, the father of sociolinguistics, of variationist sociolinguistics. I have resisted the term sociolinguistics for many years, since it implies that there can be successful linguistic theory or practice which is not social. Okay, so I guess the first thing I want to say is that, in general, I don't think modern linguists of almost any ilk deny nowadays, at least broadly speaking, that corpora are useful. They're used across linguistics, they're used in formal linguistics and generative linguistics. There are extreme people who don't use them or think they're, reject them outright. But in general, these get used across linguistics. I think it's fair to say, Sinclair said it in Trust the Text in 2004, that corpora are this incredible success story in linguistics, and that's certainly true. It's only become more true in the last 20 years. And so they're used widely, but they're used with reservation. And so while it is accepted that corpora can provide positive evidence of what's possible, so you can look in a corpus and see that things happen, and this gives you evidence that these things are possible, there are these, as I've already mentioned, there are these kind of main critiques, which is one, that they don't give you evidence of things that are possible but that are too uncommon or happen not to occur in your corpus. So, you get positive evidence, but you don't get positive evidence of everything that is possible. The more serious, or at least the argument that's taken as being even more problematic, is that they don't give you negative evidence. And this is what intuitions give you, right, or supposedly give you. And that is to say, you can ask somebody, can you say this? And they can say no. And that's something that a corpus doesn't give you. This is seen as a major limitation of corpus linguistics. The other point there is, I think, less important and probably isn't of so much concern anymore, but it's also accepted that ungrammatical structures do occur in corpora due to performance issues, so like errors or slips of the tongue, things like that. And so the view is that alternatively, you can then turn to intuitions, you can turn to informants, you can ask them questions, and this will give you negative evidence. This will let you test really rare constructions that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And at the same time, I think most linguists nowadays think there are limitations there too, with bias and memory and things like that. And so the general view now, I'd say, is that you need to use both of these, that neither is perfect, and that they work together to support each other. I'm going to argue against that here. Yeah, here's a quote from Carson Schutze's important book on kind of doing experimental, doing elicitation judgments in a really experimental way, right? And so he says, it's not immediately obvious why a description of people's competence should be based on behavior in situations where they are reporting intuitions. And then he says, here's some of the reasons. First, why we do this, like why we should use intuitions. So first, by eliciting judgments, we can examine reactions to sentence types that might occur only very rarely in spontaneous speech or recorded corpora. Okay, so that's that first point about positive evidence. A second related reason for using grammaticality judgments is to obtain a form of information that scarcely exists within normal language use at all, namely negative information, so negative evidence, in the form of strings or, constructions, utterances that are not part of the language. And then the third reason for using judgments is that when one is merely observing speech, it is difficult to distinguish reliably slips, unfinished utterances, and so forth from grammatical production. And so that's the basic reason why people doubt corpora or say that there's limitations. And so, like I say, for this reason, we now have this current situation in linguistics where it's sort of nice. We use both, right? And in general, I think most linguists, including most people who are outside of corpus linguistics, would say that both of these types of data are important, they complement each other, and that we need both to do linguistics. And this is even by many corpus linguists, probably by some corpus linguists in this room, certainly not by everyone, but here's a quote from McHenry and Wilson's textbook, Corpus Linguistics and Introduction. So Chomsky's criticisms, these very ones that were mentioned there from aspects, and the ones that Schutze reported, Chomsky's criticisms are not wholly invalidated, nor indeed could they be. Chomsky revealed some powerful verities, and these shape the approach taken to the corpus today. A corpus and an introspection-based approach to linguistics are not mutually exclusive. In a very real sense, they can be gainfully viewed as being complementary. And so I think this is probably the standard view of corpus linguistics. I think it's one that I don't think Sinclair would agree with, but it's certainly one I don't agree with, and that's what I'd like to argue against. What's really been lacking, though, in all of these is like actual empirical evidence. And so you'll see both sides making these arguments. They're normally based on logic. Sometimes they're based on analogy to other fields of study. There's not really clear evidence about this until now, I would say, with language models. Here's a quote from Jeffrey Sampson, who is on the more extreme corpus side of things, and from a paper of his called Objective Evidence is All We Need. The most important reason why so many linguists have accepted the intuition-based approach to linguistics seems to be an issue about negative evidence, and this seems right to me. We can observe people in speech or writing using some of the many arrangements of words which are possible in their language, but there's no corresponding type of observation which explicitly shows that some particular arrangements of words is impossible in the language. To see how wrong-headed this conclusion is, think what the analogous argument would sound like in some solidly scientific domain of inquiry, say the theory of gravity in physics. And so we kind of see here, kind of like Chomsky before, saying that other scientists don't do this. Here's Sampson saying other scientists don't do this. But we're just taking everyone's word for this, and it's not totally clear to me that just because a physicist does or doesn't do something, that this is what all we need to justify what we do. Okay, so the claim I want to argue for here in this first part of this talk is that the success of large language models, which at a base level are just trained on observation, right? They're just trained on big, large corpora that they learn from, provides really indisputable empirical evidence that grammatical structure can be inferred entirely on the observation of language use. And that's specifically on these patterns of lexical co-occurrence. I don't want to go into tons of details about how a language model works, but I do want to make it clear, we're talking about the base model here at the most kind of basic level, right? So these are not the ones that are embedded. These are embedded inside a chatbot, but this is not a chatbot, okay? This is what underlies a chatbot or, modern chatbots like ChatGPT. The basic task of language modeling is really simple. It's just to predict the probability of word tokens occurring in a text, so in context, predict how likely word tokens are, given previously observed word tokens in context in other texts, okay? So the language model sees large amounts of data, and then where they see what comes next, what are the orders of words in a corpus, and then based on that, they're then trained to predict next words, the probability of next words or of words in contexts. And based on that, we get this remarkably successful, remarkably fluent models of language. In particular, in causal language models, there's different types of language models, but the one that we're most kind of familiar with now, or at least the one that we engage with the most, are called causal language models like GPT. The task is specifically to predict the next word token given previous word tokens. Okay, so it's very much like on your phone when you're typing in and it says this is the next word. It gives you 3 words. Those are the top 3 most predictable words in that context. And that's really what a basic language model does too. So if we have these 4 tokens, he went for the language model needs to predict the probability of the next word, and you might say these are just made up, but you know that walk is most likely, run is next, and ride is next, and they each have a probability. That's the basic task, and when these get embedded into chatbots like ChatGPT or various other applications, they prove to be remarkably fluent, right? If you've dealt with ChatGPT, you've seen that it's, you know, if nothing else, grammatical, right? And if nothing else, very complex in the grammatical structures it can make. In fact, I mean, the main thing that probably distinguishes between student writing and ChatGPT writing is the lack of performance errors, right? I mean, that is, you know, students make performance errors, but ChatGPT does not. It's very fluent, and it's very grammatical and very diverse. Okay, so a lot of this comes back to Firth, right? So Firth is often now quoted. I think there's not a lot of reason to believe that the people who invented the initial kind of, you know, word-to-vec and some of these early modern language models knew about Firth, but, you know, they're at Stanford and places like that, so there's probably some possibility that this passes through. And, you know, these are the famous Firth quotes. The first one's the most famous. It's always quoted, "You shall know a word by the company it keeps." And here's another one. I propose to split up the meaning or function, I propose to split up meaning or function into a series of component functions. Each function will be defined as the use of some language form or an element in relation to some context. Meaning, that is to say, is to be regarded as a complex of contextual relations. I mean, that is the basic idea that underlies language models today, which is why Firth is often cited. So, just to kind of recap, the basic task of language modeling underlies the remarkable fluency of chatbots like ChatGPT, which are able to consistently generate diverse and wholly grammatical output. To me, this is the evidence that you can, through observation of language, infer its structure. Of course, the grammars that LLMs learn, or they're internalized in LLMs, they're not really accessible directly. And it's presumably different from how humans represent language, although I don't know. But that's kind of beside the point, right? The point is that that's sufficient data for an LLM to infer language structure, and that, you know, that should be sufficient for linguists as well, or at least we shouldn't say that it's insufficient. And so LLM fluency, to me, proves that linguists can, in principle, infer the structure of language solely through corpus analysis and without any negative evidence, because they don't get negative evidence themselves. This is, just for what it's worth, the sort of one of the things that really kind of made language modeling so powerful, and that's the transformer architecture, which came out in just 2023, and the paper there is called "Attention is All You Need," which is where the title of this paper comes from. I didn't realize that Sampson had such a similarly titled paper when I titled this one. Okay, the last point I want to make here before we move on to the double modals is that this isn't just evidence of the value of corpus linguistics, it's really evidence of the value of the power of the validity of Sinclairian corpus linguistics. Because these LLMs are not just trained in line with sort of general principles of corpus linguistics. In fact, they're kind of at odds with what many corpus linguists believe, including ones that from the tradition which I came from. And that is that they meet these 4 kind of basic tenets, I think, and often maligned tenets of Sinclairian corpus linguistics that are all very consistent with how large language models have been developed, designed, trained. The 4 of them are the use of very large and largely unstructured monitor corpora, right? So one thing that Sinclair argued for very strongly is that we need to get these corpora as big as we can, that there's value in size, and that, you know, as you pick up size, you start to lose the ability to annotate, to structure these corpora. That's certainly true, right? These large language models are trained on huge amounts of data. Like I said, the other point here is that they're not annotated. These corpora are just corpora. They just are the raw text. They are not marked for part of speech. There's very little internal structure or annotation to these corpora, and these are unsupervised learning, okay? The third one is that they focus on lexis, right? They're focusing on, underlyingly, they're looking at these collocational patterns, essentially, right? These patterns of co-occurrence. They're not looking at parsed corpora, they're not looking at grammatical structures, they're just looking at what words tend to occur together. And finally, what we see here is that grammar emerges from the analysis of meaning and lexis in the corpus, okay? So first you look at the meaning, and from that comes the grammar. These approaches, or in general, the Sinclairian approach is called Neo-Firthian because, it carried on the Firthian tradition, as Sinclair himself said. I don't know, the neo part sounds maybe slightly derogatory. And it really, like I say, contrasts strongly with how corpus linguistics is practiced elsewhere in the world. Here's Sinclair's, here's just 4 quotes from Corpus, Concordance, and Collocation. These are all just making those 4 points I made, but I think they're worth reading because they seem very prescient in hindsight. The only guidance I would give is that a corpus should be as large as possible and should keep growing. The best way to keep this wastage to a minimum is to work for as long as possible with data in a form close to its physical occurrences, and only to introduce abstractions when these are unavoidable. And these are never introduced into large language models. They are totally avoidable. Most everyday words do not have an independent meaning or meanings, but are components of a rich repertoire of multi-word patterns that make up a text. And finally, the evidence now becoming available casts grave doubts on the wisdom of postulating separate domains of lexis and syntax. I think all of these things have just proven to be totally true, and they're all sort of fundamental to the development of language models. And then here's the other side. So this is a quote from McHenry and Hardy's 2012 Corpus Linguistics textbook. They could not possibly write this now. This would seem entirely inconsistent with what's happened in the last 5 years or so. But they wrote, while the work at UCL and Lancaster was influential, a quite distinct school, and they're implying not as influential, a quite distinct school of corpus linguistics was developed at the University of Birmingham by John Sinclair. This school had a distinctive approach to the construction of corpora, very large corpora, questioned the process and utility of corpus annotation, developed the notion of collocation, and took a corpus-driven approach to the analysis of English grammar, in which words and grammar were ineluctably bound in what has been called lexical grammar. That's the nice part of this book. The next part from the second quote comes quite a bit later in a chapter about Birmingham, and they say, or about Neo-Firthians, as they say. There's little doubt that among Neo-Firthians, the work of Sinclair has been deeply influential, but just among Neo-Firthians. Yet the limitations of Sinclair's approach to corpus linguistics may be to some extent adverse consequences of its strengths. And I think, we now see this probably isn't true, right? That these are only strengths of the method, and one that is proven by the success of language models. Okay, so that's the first part of my talk. And I, just to sort of sum up, the idea here is that, these language models are really our validation of a Sinclairian approach. That this is not validation of corpus linguistics in general. I mean, it is compared to, say, formal linguistics, but these are specifically in line with Sinclairian principles. And that, Neo-Firthian, Firth is now probably the second most quoted linguist in the world, very important. And so, this is something we should be proud of here at Birmingham, that we are a Neo-Firthian and a Sinclairian department that really predicted the approach to linguistics and to the study of language that now dominates natural language processing, language sciences in general. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about then is about double modals. And this has nothing to do with large language models now. I want to sort of show an example of a study that I think is Sinclairian, and that really shows why positive evidence, why corpus isn't just all you need, but in fact, it's what you need. And that if you don't have corpora, you will just go astray. And I'm picking double modals because I've done work on it, but also because they are an excellent example of something that was supposed to be especially hard to study through corpus linguistics, and that when we look at them, what we find is that they're actually the most necessary thing to study through corpus linguistics. That actually, as things get rare, that a corpus-based approach becomes more important. Intuition doesn't step in to fix the problem, that the problems with intuition only become worse as we're dealing with rarer and rarer constructions. So these are 4 double modals. These are all from American English. There's been parallel work now done by my co-author here and me on British English. We find very much the same results here, but this is the study that I think is more interesting. And then they've also been doing work on Australian English where they replicate the same results. I think everything I say here is probably true of the English language in general, including for all of you, even though probably none of you use double modals. The point we're going to make is that you could, or you might could. So here's the first one. These are examples of double modals. So these are just two modal verbs stacked up. They could be split by like a negator or by an adverb or something. But here they are. Something like shit might could get real on Friday. I might can just come and scoop you. We'll see though. The Spurs will should win in 5 against the Grizz. That's a basketball reference. But I might accidentally flirt with her. And I think although you probably don't use these yourselves, you can kind of figure out what they mean. You can essentially assign like an adverb meaning to the first modal. So shit maybe could get real on Friday is how you might read that. Okay, double modals have been one of the main topics, or maybe not one of the main topics, but an important topic in sociolinguistics, in American sociolinguistics in particular, because they're most common in the United States. But they're ones that have always been really problematic because they're so hard to observe. So here's a quote from Ron Butters, who, I don't know, maybe is more well known now as a forensic linguistics. As a forensic linguist, he's recently passed away, but he used to work on double modals. Oh yeah, Malcolm O'Dome. And he said, the use of a purely objective methodology, and he means here like, observing in language use, for investigating double modal constructions would require many hours of recording of the informal speech of many individuals. And many hours is probably an understatement. It seems unlikely that we might develop techniques of eliciting spontaneous productions. And then Ron Butters also in this paper, which was in the first N wave ever, cites a paper from a very famous paper from Bill Above a couple years before, who says there remains, and he was talking in general here, there remains a residual and almost insoluble problem: the rarity of many grammatical forms. It will no doubt always be necessary to extend our observations with intuitions. And so what I want to show here is that that's not true, at least in this case. We can now get enough data to do this. But second, that these intuitions, you're better off not using intuitions at all, right? You're better off just saying, we'll just wait till we get enough data. Okay, so this is the paper here that I'm going to sort of describe. This was published a couple years ago. It's with Cameron Morin, who's now in Paris, and work that was part of his PhD dissertation. He did field work as well and studied British double modals as well. But okay, so like I said, double modals are sequences of two modal verbs in the same tense clause. And this is very challenging because formal grammars don't usually accept that. And this is part of the reason why they're such a controversial topic, is because they're very difficult to analyze within like a generative grammar. Part of Cameron's interest isn't mine, but is about studying these within a construction grammar framework and showing that construction grammar can handle these kind of constructions. They're generally considered to be some of the most elusive grammatical structures in the English language. And so in this paper, what we were trying to do was establish the possible range of double modals in American English and to map their usage across the United States to show where they come from. And then we also considered theories about the sociolinguistics and the origins of double modals, which I will discuss today, and then also about their semantics, which I'm not going to discuss because that wasn't my part of the paper. That's been my main interest in double modals as a sociolinguist, as a corpus linguist who does sociolinguistics, is to understand their use, their variation, and their origins, which I just think we're saying, like, this is way more complicated than anyone's knowledge of them, right? Like, nobody has this knowledge in their head, but this knowledge is out there in the real world, or these patterns are out there in the real world, and they're very complicated to describe, as you'll see, and you need a lot of data to do it. But the reason I want to do them today isn't for these reasons. I'll go through these points, but the reason I want to do them is because they really show an example of this problem of inferring grammatical knowledge, right? Like, how do you, as a linguist, infer the structure of double modals? The way this has been done is through intuitions, but like I say, we'll see that that doesn't really work. And the most basic question here is what combinations, like what pairs of modals are possible, okay? And like I say, for this reason, people have relied on elicitation and intuitions because there just hasn't been the data to observe these in the real world. And like I say, what I want to say is that we can't do that. Like, in fact, this is wrong. It gives you the exact opposite results that are true, and that to actually understand how double modals are used, you have to observe them in language data, or at least when you do observe them in natural language data, they contradict all these assumptions that have been based on intuitions. Okay, so here's what we think we know, right? I'm going to show that, well, 4 to 5 of those assumptions or findings are wrong. You'll see these repeated all the time. All 5 of these get mentioned all the time. This is a popular topic in the US especially, where people like this topic. It's often what a sociolinguist will say, talk about to the media or something. And so you can find these, very commonly said. So first, the general claim is that might could is the most common double modal. So I might could do that. And that otherwise there's a very small and limited set of additional double modals in American English, or in particular in Southern English. So the third claim there is that these are especially common and in fact only occur in the Deep South of the United States. And that in particular, well, not in the Deep South, but in the South in general. In fact, the view is that they're not most common in the Deep South, that they're most common in Appalachia, okay? And that they originated from Scotch-Irish settlers. So there are double modals in Scottish English, especially in the borders, less nowadays than there once were. But the view is that people migrated from Ireland, Scottish people who were in Ireland. They then moved into Appalachia. That's where we know they migrated to, and that they brought, in the process, double modals into American English, which weren't there previously. Okay, so this is the standard view. There's even, in particular that second point, there's a very limited number of these. The standard view is actually that either double modals don't really exist in some sense, that either the first modal is actually an adverb, or that these are just kind of multi-word units that are stored as single lexical items, or a single modal verb that are stored as a one-word unit that has 2 parts to it. Okay, so in terms of the data, what we have here is a corpus of about 9 billion words. It's about 1 billion tweets collected over 1 year between 2013 and 2014. What's particularly interesting about this corpus, I think, is that all the tweets are geolocated. So we have the longitude and latitude of the person when they posted the tweet, right down to the meter. Okay, so this is, 1 billion geolocated texts where we can tell exactly where the person was. These were then sorted into around 3,000 counties. These are the counties of the US. Okay, so we have a corpus here that's highly stratified into 3,000 subcorpora. None of these texts are annotated. They're very hard to annotate. There's huge amounts of them, but they're also in a very informal variety of English, right? So hard to annotate them. I mean, there are now tools that will kind of part of speech tag these, but not at the time. And what we then did was just simply extract all the sequences of 2 modal verbs in a row. Okay, so we just looked through, I can't think, there's like 11 modal verbs we looked at, so we just found every example of 2 of them in a row. This gave us 10,000 possible tokens, which we then did a full concordance line analysis of and just went through and checked every single one of them. This was done by Elvis in part. This was done years ago at Aston when we were there. This then lay dormant for almost 10 years until Cameron found an old video or a copy of me giving this talk in N-Wave in Toronto maybe, or yeah. And he found it. He was really interested in double modal, so he contacted me and said, can we resurrect this research? And we did. And so we checked all of them. I'll tell you how many were remaining. There's a lot of false positives here. Things like he may, could I, right? Like where there's a clausal boundary that isn't marked because it's a tweet, or my friend Will could do that. Will could, right? So you have to go through and check these, right? And so we checked every one of them multiple times actually. And I think although I wouldn't think about this at all at the time. This is really mostly consistent with Sinclairian principles, right? Like it's an unannotated corpus. It's huge. And it's just looking at co-occurrence patterns. The difference here is that it's stratified, highly stratified, right? Like it's very much has internal structure to this corpus, and that we do some frequential analysis. Although the statistics are largely very simple. That's necessitated by this dialogical focus, right? Okay, so the first thing we find, so there is, from that 10,000, there are 5,000 or so, 5,500 double modal tokens in the corpus. There's a thing that is collected at the University of South Carolina. It's called the multimode database. This is the database of all previously observed double modal tokens. mostly gathered through intuitions or judgments, and they had 2,000 of them. So in this one corpus, we more than double the total inventory of double modals that have ever been observed in linguistics. And here's the kind of most surprising part, I think, of the whole study, and that is that we discovered in the corpus 76 double modal types, so 76 unique combinations of modals, okay? That is 69% of the 110 possible double modal combinations. This is excluding the same modal twice, like may, or could, okay? So what we see here is that, in this corpus, we can observe that a majority of the possible double modals occur, okay? And that compares to only 30 double modals that have been observed in multimo. And then we also found that might can, and I think this is probably another very surprising result, is that might could is not the most common double modal at all. Might can occurs 1,700 times in the corpus, and might could only occurs 932 times. It's the second most common. And so already we're starting to see how the intuitions have led us astray, right? One, these are way more diverse than anyone's ever acknowledged. And two, the one that's supposed to be by far and away the most common is not the most common. In fact, might can is rarely mentioned as even being possible. We can look at the patterns here of how they combine. So this is first modal as rows and second modal as columns. Okay, and you can see we exclude things like might, and can. And there's, you can see here that there's a real pattern here. I mean, we've organized these based on how frequently they combine. But you can see that it's very diverse, that there's a lot of possible combinations here, and that there is some patterning here, and the semantics are discussed in the paper. They're not random which ones occur, but we can see that most of them occur. The next thing we did is that we mapped their relative frequencies across the counties of the US. So now we're taking advantage of this highly stratified corpus where we have the long and lat of every text. And as we would expect, we find that many, or that in general, these are most common in the south of the US. So here's a map of all the double modals in the corpus. This isn't split up by type, and this is just where they occur. And so what you can see here is that they're more concentrated in the southeastern part of the United States, right? So, oh no, okay, I won't do that. But if you don't know your US geography, then this is Texas, this is New York City, this is Florida, here's Atlanta. So in the southern part of the United States, they are most concentrated, but I think what's surprising here is that they are occurring all over the United States as well. I'll come back to that in one sec. Here they are. So we call these traditional double modals. These are the double modals that occur primarily in the south when we look at the map. But what you should see here is that there's only 16 of them. So there's might can and might could, may can, might would. These are the ones that are fairly well attested in the literature already. Okay, and here are some of their maps. So there's might can and might could on the left, right? And you can see that they are more concentrated in the southeast than that general map would show, right? And you can see how they kind of start to, get very sparse, but you can still see that pattern there. Okay, what we then surprisingly find, though, is that there are many non-traditional double modals. These are ones that tend not to be acknowledged in the literature, and they don't show clear regional patterns, and they're not concentrated in the south. They occur across the United States, seemingly at random, as in there's no regional pattern in them at all. And this explains in part why we find so many, right? Because we're looking elsewhere for them. We're looking across the United States. We're not doing field work. We don't go into a particular community where we expect to find them. We find them in places you wouldn't expect them. So here they are. These are the 60 double modals that are not generally attested in the literature. A few of them are, but in general, these are the ones that aren't. And they show a very different regional pattern. Okay, so this is the overall regional pattern here. And you can see there's really not much of a pattern at all. Okay, they're just used across the United States. And this is a very surprising result. I think a lot of traditional sociolinguists just don't believe it, but this is very much in the data. Here's a few examples. So can could, can will should, would should, for example. Okay, all very unusual. Here they are in context. So you can just see that these are being used in ways that you can interpret the meaning of. These are not just sort of errors. Yo, that LG G flex might be my next phone. I used to would do anything to feel loved, but now I'll do anything for y'all not to be even cordial. I used to really tick you off then. My attitude used to be awful. If you didn't have to sell your soul, I would join a club. Okay, so what I want to make the claim here is that although we don't see all 110 of them, right, we don't have negative or positive evidence on these other, whatever it would be, 34, okay? I think we can actually infer that all of them are possible, right? Like once you get to 76, there's no reason if this corpus was twice as big, we wouldn't see another 20 of them. If the corpus was 10 times as big, we wouldn't see all of them. I think that's a fairly reasonable assumption here. And so what we think is that this result is really strong evidence that double modals are a productive construction in English. And not just American English, but like I said, it's now been found in British English, Australian English. These are different corpora, the Australian English data. And there's actually been another side study by Stephen Coates on American English, which is based on YouTube data from town halls across the US. Whenever we look at these large corpora, we find this incredibly diverse number of double modals. And so we think this is evidence that these are used productively. These are not single units. These are not things that people memorize, that the English language, the grammar of English language licenses double modals, okay? All of us have the potential to say double modals. They're not nearly as impossible as been made out. They're obviously incredibly rare, and presumably that's because they express meaning that we can express other ways, both semantic meaning and social meaning. But it would seem that the English language, as acquired by speakers around the world, allows for these. And like I said, this is a really problematic finding because generative grammars cannot handle this. In general, formal grammars can't account for these constructions. They really break a basic assumption of formal grammars, which is that you can't have two tense verbs in a single clause. Okay, the other thing we can do now is we can zoom in on the South and see what's happening there, okay? And what we surprisingly find, I mean, this is probably this is another one of the most surprising results, is that they're not common in Appalachia at all. So Appalachia is up at the very top of the map there. I can mark it here for you. So this is Appalachia. It kind of comes down here. These are the Appalachian Mountains, okay? Now this is all controlled for the amount of data we have, okay? This is not just a product of low population density in this region. Here's West Virginia and Kentucky. Like this is the central part when they say Appalachia. That's where the work's been done, and we find very few of them there. They're not absent. You can see over here, they're not absent. This is like a kind of a hotspot map on the right, but they're rare there. Where they're really common is down in the deep south, right, through here. Okay, that's where they're common. That's very much against the general view. And what is that? Well, that's the area where African Americans are the predominant part of the population in the US. So what we can show here is that actually, in general, these southern double modals are most common in the parts of the United States that have the highest proportion of African Americans, which leads to a pretty clear finding, or a pretty clear result, which is that they're not Appalachian forms, they are African American forms. We can take a look at this. Okay, so here's a map of African American population in the US. And what we can do now is correlate those maps we just saw for each of the double modals against where African Americans live. And that bar chart you see on the right shows you how strongly correlated all those double modals are to African American population. And what you can see here is that all but one of them is positively correlated, some very strongly. I'll show you some images in a second. And really none are strongly correlated with where white Americans live in the South. Here are a couple of maps. These are maybe a little bit hard to see, but basically what they're trying to show you is the overlap between might can on the top and might could on the bottom. And so in these maps, the area in blue is where African Americans are particularly well represented in those counties. The areas in pink are where might can on the first map are most common, and then the overlap there is shown in kind of purple. And what we're trying to visualize here, you can probably take a look at the paper for more detail. We have a lot of these maps, is that those two distributions overlap a lot, okay? Where African Americans live in the US is where double modals are used on Twitter, okay? Strong correlations. So, and there's variation here too. So, what's maybe unsurprisingly is the double modal that's very strongly associated with African Americans is might can, the one that's always been said, well, that's not been noticed to exist even, which is the most common, right? So the double modal that's actually most common in American English is the one that is very indicative of African American English. And you can see why through, linguists doing surveys that you would miss this, because you just don't go ask those people. You go to Appalachia, you ask people there, you find it among white people in Appalachia, but you can't really tell if it's common in Appalachia compared to the rest of the United States. That was assumed. And you have to make these assumptions to do these kind of intuitive studies, okay? So I think this is precisely why Mike Cann's been so underestimated. Okay, finally, the last point I want to make here is that, so this theory about where double modals come from. So this is the so the problem here, right, is that there is no historical record of this. This is apparently a kind of an old form. So how did double modals get into American English? And this is the standard view. You'll find this in textbooks. You'll find it, you can ask ChatGPT, it will tell you this too, this view. And that is that they were brought in by the Scotch-Irish who settled to the Upper South, especially Appalachia. We know this, that's certainly true, okay? And so the idea is that Scottish-Irish settlers come over, quite late, right? This is after the British, even after lots of Germans come. They come into the part of America that hadn't been settled in the Appalachian Mountains. They don't have slaves. These are poor, rural Scotch-Irish people. And that from there, they bring them in and they spread into the South, across the South, okay? So here's the story, but I think it's very hard to reconcile with the results I just showed you, right? So I don't think Twitter tells you everything, but I do think that like a theory of double modals should be consistent with what we see on Twitter, right? Like, I mean, it's hard to say how that would be so different, right? So the general view is that double modals are common in, these are the results that are very hard to reconcile with that theory. So double modals are most common in the Deep South, not in Appalachia. Double modals are most strongly with African American language. And they're also used productively, it seems, across the US. That's really hard to reconcile with this idea that, you know, Scotch-Irish settlers brought them in. What we think is something different, right? So that double modals are generally possible in American English and English in general, that the traditional Southern system was originally an African American innovation, perhaps related to creolization. This is a long debate in sociolinguistics that really split the field back in the 70s, where white scholars like Bill Above argued that, you know, African American English is just a dialect of English, and black scholars argued that actually it was a Creole, it's its own language that arose. And double modals occur in lots of Creole languages, so we think it's evidence of that as well. Okay, so here's, like I said, what we thought we knew about double modals, and you know, almost all of those are wrong. So Mike Can is actually the most common double modal, not Mike Could. Double modals are used productively. All double modals appear to be possible. It is correct that double modals are especially common in the South, but not in Appalachia, not in the Upper South, in the Lower South. And that it appears that double modals originate from African American English. And, you know, here are a couple quotes from John that I think are very much in line with this kind of study. It is my belief that a new understanding of the nature and structure of language will shortly be available as a result of the examination of large collection of texts. And so, you know, I think this is what we're doing here for double modals. There has been a distinct shortage of information and evidence available to linguists, and this gives rise to a particular balance between speculation and fact in the way in which we talk about our subject. In linguistics, up till now, we have been relying heavily on speculation. And when we actually get the data, then we don't need to speculate anymore. We can actually say what's happening. Okay, so I just want to wrap up then with a few general points. One, like I've been arguing here, not only is corpus linguistics sufficient, not only is that all you need, but that's what you need. That if you rely on intuitions for these kind of, especially for these rare structures, which are supposed to be the ones that are most unsuitable for corpus analysis, you get the wrong results. Corpus analysis keeps you honest, right? Like you don't just go along with, you know, the people you happen to interview, the people who maybe were easiest to interview. Specifically, there's two parts of this, right? The fluency of LLMs, which, like I said, are only trained on these large annotated corpora, the base models, offer definitive evidence of this claim, and that without access to sufficient positive evidence of the structure of interest, linguists cannot reliably infer linguistic structures, as I think the analysis of double modals really clearly shows. You know, the view that corpora don't give you positive evidence, that if you lack positive evidence, you can't say much, is right, but it doesn't mean that you then just rely on intuitions, right? You just have to wait till you get evidence that's relevant. Negative evidence then is crucially not needed to infer grammatical structure, and negative evidence collected via intuitions in particular is likely to be wrong. I think I just want to make a kind of a last point then about like the study of language cognition. I mean, like I said, that's not my interest, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that not being your interest, despite what formal linguists will tell you. But I think it's really important to say this, that if we don't have a reliable understanding of the basic structure of language, then we can't really hope to understand how it's acquired and represented in the mind. You need to first know what that thing is. There was that Chomsky quote, which I put up earlier, that the study of performance has to follow from competence. But that really seems backwards to me. If you don't know what the structures are, then how can you study how they're acquired or represented in the mind? I mean, in the case of double modals, for example, we clearly don't see them, right? Like the child's not exposed to them. Most of you've never been exposed to them until now, at least in the amount I've just shown you. This seems to be something like a byproduct or like something that comes out of the structure that we learn, okay? But we don't know this until we see it, and it's really important that we don't get this flipped around. I want to say that I'm not trying to say that there aren't other types of questions that we need other types of data for. Clearly, if you're interested in the processing of language, like in psycholinguistics, you're interested in perception of language and perceptual sociolinguistics, you can't do this through observation of natural language. You should rely on surveys. You should rely on experiments. You should rely on, cognitive tests and things like that. But that doesn't, the point here is that to understand the structure of language, you need to rely on language itself. I guess the last point I just want to make, and just to end, is that this is a department and a city where this type of linguistics was pioneered. This Neo-Firthian was used in 2012 as something of a slur. This is a real mistake. It's something we should be proud of. We should really take up the mantle of being Firthians and Sinclairians and see this as a great, LLMs in particular, as a great evidence of how powerful those ideas were. Thank you.